Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Hamutahl Cohen. I work with UC Cooperative Extension, and I'm going to help MC this event today. Our meeting today is brought to you by UC Cooperative Extension, the Avocado Society, and the Avocado Commission. We've had a few changes to the lineup. Ben Faber was supposed to be here to lead the meeting, but unfortunately is not feeling well. And then Marllon Santos, our third speaker, also came down with something. It seems like this flu season is really, really brutal. But Mary Lou Arpaia is here to step in. She's going to give his presentation. Okay, other notes before we start. I want to say thank you to all the sponsors who made this meeting possible. And then also give a reminder that we have a number of other seminars and meetings that are coming up that you can learn about on the Avocado Society website. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Inaki. Please come up.
Okay, thank you, Hamutahl. Thank you all for coming here today. My name is Inaki Hormaza. I'm coming from Spain. I started to work in pollination biology in different crops since I got my PhD at UC Davis a long time ago. And I've been working in avocado for the last 20 years. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell you about avocado pollination and how we can improve the way we pollinate avocado and how we can get more fruits. I will introduce where I come from. I come from Spain, and I'm going to spend like 4 months here in a sabbatical leave working in avocado pollination in the area. And I'm working in a research center in southern Spain, in Malaga. And we have there a experimental station. It's called La Mayora Experimental Station, in which we have been working with different tropical fruit crops for the last 40, 50 years. This is where we are based, in the southern part of Spain here, and this is here in the province of Malaga. And in fact, all this started about 60 years ago with a collaboration with the German government, and we established this research center, initially with material of avocado from California. This was the first planting of avocados in the area in the early 70s. And the material came from here, from California, and people started to work with this crop in Spain at that time. And after that, the landscape of this area has changed from a very dry condition with cultivating almonds and olives to growing now different tropical crops, mainly avocado, but also other crops like mangoes, lychees, sugar apples, star fruits, etc., even coffee. Okay, so we're going to talk about avocado pollination, and as you know, the main variety worldwide is CAS. So most of the things I'm going to tell you today is about this variety CAS, which is the leading variety worldwide for avocado. And avocado is cultivated in over 50 countries worldwide, and in all of them, CAS is cultivated. So the thing is that we are planting the same variety in different environments, and we have to be careful when we extrapolate the results from one country to another. Sometimes the climate is different, so we cannot extrapolate exactly the same experiments and the same results from one country to another. So what I'm going to tell you today is mainly based on our experience in the conditions in southern Spain, which are very similar to those here in California, but not the same. So we have to be careful with that, okay? So this is just examples of avocado CAS growing in Chile in the mountains, but also in tropical climates like Colombia, subtropical in Mexico, the desert in the coast of Peru, or Mediterranean countries like Spain or Italy. And of course, there are many more varieties available, but as I said, most of the results are going to be about CAS. Okay, so going about pollination, this is a typical CAS avocado tree in full bloom. This is the inflorescence with hundreds of flowers, and the main problem here is that of all those flowers, only a few will produce fruit. So this is the question that we've been trying to answer from a research group in Spain in the last 20 years. Why this happens? Why avocado produces so many flowers and only a few of them are going to be able to produce fruits? And as you will see, there are different factors involved to explain that situation. So this is eventually the result. From all those hundreds of flowers, only a few will produce fruits. Sometimes you get a situation like this and you have more fruits, but still most of the flowers have dropped. Okay, so the first thing that we realize is that when we apply pollen by hand, and you can do that in avocado, you can apply pollen on the stigma by hand, you can increase fruit set. So this is a situation in natural pollination here. Usually we get about 0.15% of fruit set, and that's pretty much conserved worldwide. So for every 1,000 flowers, only 1 or 2 will produce fruits. And that's normal. That's what happens everywhere. If we apply pollen to the flowers, we can increase that. And in this case, this was applying fuerte pollen to Haas flowers. We got 2.8% fruit set. So we increased from 0.15 to 2.8%. That's good. There's a lot of increasing, but still, keep in mind that we applied pollen and still 97% of the flowers will drop. So here we have two factors. One, that we need more pollination because we increase fruit set when we apply pollen artificially. And another one is that there is something inside the flower that means that even if you get pollen, the flower will drop. So we have these two factors playing here in the avocado. Okay, I'm going to cover just briefly the cycle of the avocado flower, which is important to understand what's going on in this cycle to understand why these things happen. So this is the avocado flower is a hermaphrodite, so you have both sexes in the flower. This will be the female part over here in the middle, and these are the anthers here where the pollen will be released. Okay, so the flower opens first as a female flower. Why this is a female flower? Because the stigma here is still white, so it's ready to receive the pollen grains, and the anthers are closed. No pollen is released yet. Okay, so the flower will open in this stage for a few hours, and then the flower will close in the afternoon, usually with Haas. And then the next day, the flower will open again, like this, but now in a male stage. It's male because the anthers are already open, releasing the pollen, and the stigma is starting to change to brown, so it's not so receptive for the pollen grains. This is a male flower. The male flower will be open for a few hours also, and then it will close. And then after that, the flower will not open again. In some cases, depending on the temperature, we can have a situation in which we have an overlap between closing female flowers and opening male flowers. If we have insects working at that time, then we can have transfer of pollen from male flowers to the female flowers in the same inflorescence. But this lasts for only a few hours. And I will show you this to you in a video later. So we have the female flower, the next day the male flower, and in some cases you have this overlap between female and male flowers. And this is called, in botany, protogynous dichogamy. Okay? So this is just a drawing of the situation. The female stage is here. Within a few hours, the flower closes, and then the male stage, and the flower will close, and it will not open again. So the life of a single flower of avocado is 2 days. You have flowers for 1, 2, or 3 months, but different flowers. Each single flower only lasts a couple of days. And I'm going to show you this in a video at high speed. So you will see that first there will be a couple of flowers opening in the female stage, these ones here. They will stay open for a few hours, and then they will close overnight. Then time passes, and then the next day in the morning, you will see that some flowers will open as females here, and then these ones that opened yesterday as females will open then as males. So these are the new female flowers here, and these ones are the ones that opened yesterday as male flowers. I think there is a problem with the video. So here we have the overlap. This is the male flowers of yesterday, and these are the female flowers of today. And this can last 1, 2 hours as most. It's a good opportunity for the bees to work in the same inflorescence. So they can transfer pollen from flowers which are very close one to each other. Okay, in Haas, the flowers open as females in the morning usually. So, and they start to close in the afternoon. So it's about 2 hours at between 1 to 3 p.m. sometimes 2 to 4 p.m., depending on the temperature the days before. In cool days, it could be later. Yes, sometimes you can have the situation in which the flowers open as females at night. That's a problem. And that happens usually with when you have very cool nights. Okay, but usually the overlap in the mid-season of the avocado flowering is between 1 to 3 p.m.
If anybody have any questions, please wait for the mic because for the Zoom purpose, they need to hear the question. Thank you.
Okay, so this was the situation in general for avocado. So the flowers open twice, as a females and males, and there are two types of avocado, depending on how this behavior takes place. So we have type A, which is, for example, Hass, but also Gwen, Lamb Hass, Maluma, Pinkerton, Reed, or Mendez, Carmen Hass, and type B varieties, which are Bacon, Ettinger, Fuerte, Surprise, Walter Hall, Sutano, or Luna. And the type P varieties are the ones used as pollinators for Hass. And why is that? Okay, because in the type A cultivars like Hass, the flowers open as female in the morning, they close in the afternoon, and they open the next day in the afternoon as males. In the B-type cultivars, the flowers will open in the afternoon of the first day as females, and then the next day or 2 days later in the morning as males. Okay, so with that situation, we have something like this. This is the A cultivars here, female in the morning, male in the afternoon, and the B cultivars, female in the afternoon and male in the morning. So then the pollen can go from B-type cultivars like Bacon or Ettinger to Hass in the morning, and in the contrary, from A to B in the afternoon. Okay? So that's the cycle of the avocado flower. So once the pollen reaches the female flower and the stigma, the pollen has to arrive to the stigma first. The stigma has to be receptive. That's why when we have humid conditions, the stigma is more receptive to pollen, so pollen germination is better, because the pollen needs to hydrate. So the pollen reaches the stigma, is in a dry state, the pollen hydrates and germinates, and it's going to produce a microscopic pollen tube, which is the one which is going to make fertilization to the ovule of the flower. So the pollen tubes will grow through the style, they will reach the ovary, and finally, if everything goes okay, they will produce the fertilization of the ovule. And then you have an embryo. And then from the embryo, eventually you have the seed, and then the rest, the ovary will produce the flesh and the pericarp of the fruit, okay? If everything goes okay, we'll have the situation with a fruit, with an embryo produced by that pollen tube that reached the ovule. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about what I think are the 4 main factors that affect pollination success in avocado. And the first one is going to be environmental factors, basically humidity and temperature. Okay, we all know about climate change. We've been telling about this for years, and now, of course, we know it's here. Some people think that, okay, the earth is warming, so maybe it's going to be better for some cold climates in which you can grow avocados, but then we'll see some of the consequences of that, at least in Spain. That's just the example. In Spain, 0 means the average in the last, from 61 to 2010 of the temperatures in Spain, and you see in the last 20 years how the temperatures are higher. This is in Malaga, where I work, same situation, and this is the situation in LA, same situation. So it's been a warming in the last 20, 25 years. This is just also an example in Israel with the days above 38 degrees centigrade, so 100 Fahrenheit. In the last 20 years, you can see the increase in this. So one of the consequences for this, at least in Spain, is that we are having warmer winters, and then we are having an advance in avocado flowering season. In the last 20 years, avocado has in Spain, the flowering is taking place 20, 30 days before. So it's been an advance in the time of avocado flowering. 20 years ago, avocado used to flower in April, and now it's starting to flower in March. And that's a problem. Why is a problem? Because usually, in Spain at least, in March, temperatures are still cold and there are rainy events. So we are having an earlier blooming with lower temperatures, and thus is having a problem in fruit set and yield. So we have to be careful with this. And in fact, in some areas in Spain where blooming takes place later, usually yields are better because not only the temperatures are better for the avocado pollen and ovule, but also for the insects to pollinate. Most of the work that we have been doing with temperature and humidity has been done in the laboratory because it's difficult to play with these things in the field because avocado trees, as you know, they are huge trees. So we work with flowers like this in florist foam with water. And we can keep the flowers for about 5-6 days. That's enough to study the effect of temperature and humidity on pollen germination and pollen tube growth. So we've done a lot of studies. I'm not going to go into detail, but we've shown that you get very good pollen germination when the flower is in the female stage. This is just pollen germination at the microscope. This is a stain for pollen tubes. So you see the pollen germinates and produces pollen tubes that go through the ovary. And when you do that in the male stage, pollen germinates usually, but the pollen tube growth is not very, very good. So in this situation, the male flowers, when you pollinate them in the male stage, usually you don't get fertilization. So that's also important because you need the pollen to arrive to the stigma, but in the female stage. If the pollen arrives to the stigma in the male stage, like pollen from the same flower onto the same stigma, usually we'll get no fertilization and fruit set. At least, as I say, in Spain. This is just images at the microscope of the embryos. The thing is that you get embryo development with the female stage when you pollinate in the female stage, but you don't get that when you pollinate in the male stage. We also have been working with different temperatures and humidities. And well, finally, the idea is that there is an effect on pollen germination, but also on pollen tube growth. This is an example of temperature on pollen tube growth. When you have, this is the avocado female part, you put the pollen on the stigma, and at very low temperatures, like this one here is 50 degrees Fahrenheit, usually 2 days after pollination, the pollen tubes have not reached the ovule yet. At very high temperatures, like in this case with 86 degrees Fahrenheit in red, pollen tubes arrive to the ovary 8 hours after pollination. Why this is important? It's important because there is an interplay between the pollen tubes and the ovule. And if the pollen tubes arrive too late to the ovule, like in this case at very low temperatures, the ovules are not ready, are no longer receptive for the pollen tubes. So the pollen tube reaches the ovule, but the ovule has already is dead already. So there is no fertilization. On the contrary, when the pollen tubes arrive to the ovule very rapidly, the ovule is not ready yet for the pollen tubes. So there is no fertilization. So there is an optimum temperature which is between 15 to 25 degrees for pollen tube growth to produce successful fertilization. We also been doing different studies with in vitro pollen germination in avocado, and we've seen that there are differences among varieties. So there are varieties that which pollen behaves better at low temperatures, and others that behaves better at high temperatures. So here there is a room for improvement to select varieties that can pollinate avocado better at lower or higher temperatures. And there is a room for exploration in research in this sense. And another thing very important for avocado pollen is that the pollen has a very short viability. So the pollen is released from the anthers, but in a few hours, that pollen is no longer useful for pollination or pollen tube growth. So for example, here, experiments at room temperature, we've seen that 24 hours after the pollen is released from the anthers, that pollen is almost no viable anymore. So even if this pollen arrives to the stigma, you'll get no pollen tube growth or fertilization. You can increase that length of viability at lower temperatures, like this is an example at 4 degrees, but you see that even at 4 degrees centigrade, about 40 Fahrenheit, 5 days after the pollen is released from the anthers, that pollen is no longer viable. So that's also important because this is a very short period of pollen viability. And this is very different to other crops like almonds or other crops in which the pollen is viable for a longer time. In some cases, you can have the situation in which you have this so-called cukes. You can have some fruits of avocado. That's very typical, at least in Spain, in the variety Fuerte. And usually it's related to low temperatures during fertilization. So you get fertilization of the ovules, then there is usually low temperatures. Sometimes also this could happen with very high temperatures, and the embryo aborts. And then you have an initial development of the fruit, and eventually you'll have this kind of fruits with no embryos, but you needed fertilization before, okay? And sometimes you can also see this in Hass, small fruits with no embryos inside. Okay, so just summarizing this part about temperature and humidity. Usually temperatures above 25 degrees and below 15 degrees inhibit both pollen germination and fertilization. Also, when the humidity is below 75%, that has an effect on stigmatic receptivity. So the stigma is receptive for a shorter time. There are differences among varieties in pollen germination at different temperatures. And there is no fertilization when the pollen arrives to the stigma at the male stage. And climate change is advancing the flowering period with detrimental consequences for pollination and fertilization in avocado.
Does irrigation itself help in improving the humidity around the orchards?
Yes, that's a good question. If you have irrigation in the orchard and you do that during when the flowers are open, so this will be in the morning, midday, that is going to help to extend the period of stigmatic receptivity. What is detrimental is when you have the water on the flowers, because then the pollen will burst, will explode. Okay, so that's happened with rain. You have the pollen on the stigma and it's raining, the pollen is going to explode. Okay, so it's okay to, yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk about flower quality, which is a concept which is common in different fruit trees, but I'm going to explain this situation in avocado. So apparently when you look at the avocado flowers, they all look the same. There are no external differences among the flowers. But that's not the case when you look inside the flowers. So this is an example with, here, this is a stain for a starch. Starch is a compound that the plants use just to reserve, to have nutrients for different things. So on the left, we have a flower with a very low starch content, and on the right with high starch content. So these granules are starch granules, okay? And these two flowers were in the same inflorescence. So in the same inflorescence, you can have flowers with lower starch content and flowers with higher starch content. So our hypothesis was that maybe the flowers with high starch content are those flowers prepared to produce fruits if they get pollen. And the ones with lower starch content are weak flowers, which are going to drop regardless if there is pollen or not. And when we plot that situation of different flowers in the inflorescence, we have a few flowers with a lot of starch and most of the flowers with low or medium starch. So this was the hypothesis. Maybe these flowers here are the ones that will produce fruits if they get pollen. But this is very difficult to prove in the field because this is a destructive study. You take the flowers and then you see if there is starch or not. You don't know what will happen with the flowers. Yes, we'll go to that later. So what we did was we pollinated by hand the flowers. So this has flower, and we pollinated with an open anther of Fuerte flower. Okay, we did that with hundreds of flowers. And I told you before that the female flower closes, and then it opens the next day as male flower. So what we did is when the flower opened the next day as male, we cut the stigmas of the flowers. Here, the stigmas and the style. And we saved that in an Eppendorf tube like this one. And we left the ovaries in the field. So then we know the starch content at flowering time in the stigma and style, and then we can know what happened with that flower in the field. So basically this is what we did. Just remove the first part, the upper part, and then leave the ovary in the tree. Of course, first thing we demonstrated is that there is no an effect of that. So you get almost very, very few fruits in both cases. If you cut the styles or if you leave the styles, the fruit set is very low in both cases. There is no difference in doing this treatment because the pollen tubes are already in the ovary at the time you remove the style. So this is the situation in the field. We did this with thousands of flowers. Of course, 98% of these flowers are going to drop in a couple of days. But these are the results. So the flowers that were retained in the tree and produced fruits had a much higher starch content than the flowers that dropped. So there was an effect on the starch content, on flower quality, and on the likelihood of that flower to produce a fruit. We did the same experiments or similar experiments in New Zealand with colleagues there, and we studied not only starch, but other compounds also, like boron. The effect was more significant in New Zealand because in New Zealand there was a problem of the lack of boron in the soils. That's not a problem in Spain, so that's why we don't see differences here. But we saw that in New Zealand, so the flowers that produce fruit had also higher boron content than the flowers that dropped. Same with the starch again in both situations, but also with other carbohydrates like saccharose, fructose, glucose, persitol, or mannoctulose. So the idea here is that you have different qualities in the flowers, and some flowers are not going to produce fruits even if you pollinate them. And the thing is that most of the flowers are going to drop because most of the flowers are low in the starch content. And going to your question, can we change this situation? Well, we are doing now, at least in Spain, and I think also in California, there was some work by Carol Lobat some years ago, in which people didn't used to fertilize the fruit, the trees in the winter. We are now applying fertilization in the winter because the roots are still active and the plants are taking the nutrients also in the wintertime. So with that, we are seeing an increase in flower quality in the spring. So changing the way we are fertilizing the soils, you can increase flower quality in the spring. There's a lot of work still to do. If we can apply or you can spray with something to increase that flower quality, but that's an area that is very interesting because then we can increase fruit set at the end.
You mentioned that in an individual inflorescence, you can have both high and low quality flowers. Is there any trend to where high quality flowers tend to appear on the plant or anything that you can help us more on where we may find a high quality flower because we can't tell in the field?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, we've been working with that for a long time. We analyze flowers from different positions in the inflorescence. There is no difference. So there is no difference, not that the ones at the top or the bottom have differences in the starch content. And we don't know yet when the differences is established among the flowers. So that's something we are working on, trying to analyze when the differences among the flowers is established. We think it's very early in the inflorescence development, but we don't know yet at which moment. But this doesn't have to do with the situation of the flower in the inflorescence. Okay.
Do you have any information on which of the many fertilizers that we apply that might be the most helpful if we started applying in winter?
Basically, we are using in the winter more nitrogen than we used to use because we didn't use that in the winter. So that's what we are applying. And also, one thing is that when you have a deficit in some compounds, mainly boron or calcium, that can have an effect on pollen viability and pollen tube growth. So that's why some people, when they have low levels of calcium or boron in the leaf analysis, if they apply those boron and calcium before flowering, maybe you can increase fruit set because you are going to increase finally flower quality, but also boron and calcium, which are very important for pollen termination and pollen tube growth.
Excellent.
Okay, so then next topic is pollinators. This is a subject of debate in different countries still, and I think the reason for that is that we are comparing situations of different climates, and maybe we shouldn't do that, and we have to study this in every avocado producing region. So usually, some people have seen in some countries that there is a decrease in fruit set when you get away from the pollinator tree. I mean, if you have CAS, you get away from the B type, right, which is to pollinate CAS. but there are contradictory results. That's not the case everywhere in the world. The first works in this topic were made in, of course, in California, but also in Israel. And Israel is apparently is very clear that you need pollinizer. This is just studies in the 80s, and here we have the distance to the pollinizer tree, and this is yield. Okay, so when you go away from the pollinizer, you have a decrease in yield in different years, and that's very clear in Israel, in which temperatures are higher usually than here or in Spain in springtime, and usually the humidity is lower than here or in Spain. In California, there were some results that Arpaia was involved, and you could see a difference also with distance to pollinator. But the important thing is that this effect is just when you are very close to the pollinizer tree. When you move away more than 27 feet or so, then they are not so much, the differences are not so great. So you have an effect when you have the pollinizer tree very close to your hash tree. Results in Spain, we didn't see any difference. This is just using bacon as pollinator. The row 1 was the closest to bacon, and the row 5 was the farthest away from bacon. Yield, you see, is, well, varies, but it's not a clear trend. And there's a difference in paternity. When you check paternity in the embryos, and you can do that with molecular markers like you do in humans, you can check if the father is bacon or is hash. And when you move away from bacon, the percentage of fruits that have bacon as father decreases. And that's normal because you are farther away from the father. But at least in Spain, that usually doesn't have an effect in productivity. So you still have a lot of fruits from hash pollinated by hash in that time of overlap. Maybe that's because we have maybe a longer overlap time than in other countries like in Israel. And this is just this is an orchard with hash and different pollinizer trees. And most of the fruits that we get in that orchard, the father is hash, and you get fruits from bacon. These are different varieties: Sutano, Fuerte, even gem and lamb hash, which are A-type varieties. They can also produce fruits in hash because they have an overlap with hash. So the point here is that even if you have different pollinizer trees in the same orchard, most of the fruits in this situation will come by self-pollination of hash. Okay? And that can only occur during that period of overlap between female and male flowers open. We did some experiments also in Peru, in different parts of the country, and we found very good productivity in that case in orchards in which only there is hash. And in Peru, we're talking about hundreds of acres of single variety orchards. And that's also because the climate in the area of Peru where avocado is produced is very mild, with 18 to 20 degrees Celsius temperature, high humidity, and probably that's why you have a very nice overlap between male and female flowers. Okay, and then the last topic that I would like to cover is pollinators. So that means the vector. You need something to bring the pollen from the anthers to the stigma, and usually are insects. So the question here is if avocado production is limited by the lack of pollinators. So as I said, pollen must be transferred from the anthers to the stigma. This can occur inside the same tree if you have overlap, or between different trees when you have a B-type and an A-type. But this movement of pollen has to be made by insects. There were some experiments done here in California. This Arpaia was also involved in this some years ago, in which they proved that you need insects for this, that wind or the lack of insects affects pollination, and you get basically no fruit set in avocado. So this was made in caged avocado trees, and when you have small insects like thrips or no insects at all, you get no fruit set, and you get fruit set when you have bees inside the enclosures or the control outside. So you need insects similar to bees to have pollination in avocado. Thing is that the origin of the avocado is Central America, and the honeybees were not in America till the Europeans came. So the avocado has evolved with other native insects in the Americas, mainly Melipona bees. These are stingless bee species in the American tropics, and also some wasps and so on. But still, we are using honeybees worldwide to pollinate avocado and other crops. This is just an image of different hives of these Melipona native bees of the Americas. They can also produce honey, but in a lower quantity than the honeybee. And even the Mayas knew about this, and they used to collect honey from these Melipona bees. Okay, but this is a bee carrying avocado pollen. So the honeybees are able to carry avocado pollen and are able to pollinate avocados. So going back to the beginning of my talk, when I talk about if you apply pollen, you get more fruit set. So that means that we have a deficit of pollination. So what we did was to study this in the field and what was going on in the field. So we did an experiment, just went to one of our orchards in our research station, and we got flowers at random from CAS avocado trees. The different tones of gray here is just the number of flowers in the inflorescence, so don't worry about that. The main point here is that when you collect flowers from the trees and you study at the microscope how many flowers have pollen, you get that about 80% of the flowers don't have any pollen grains at all. So they're going to drop for sure because there is no pollination. And when you look at the flowers that have pollen, most of them have only 1 to 5 pollen grains on the stigma. Very few have more than 6 pollen grains. So in this situation, in this orchard, which is a pretty productive orchard, we're talking about 12,000 kilos per hectare, which is almost double the average in Spain. In this situation, most of the flowers don't receive pollen. So what we did was, okay, let's increase the number of beehives and see what happens. And these are the results here. So here we have 10 beehives per hectare, which is a lot for Spain, is more than usually recommended. And with this situation of 10 beehives per hectare, we get 17% of the flowers get pollen. Okay? But if you look at when those flowers get the pollen, they only get the pollen in the female stage in 3.7%. So with 10 beehives per hectare, only 3.7% of the flowers will get pollen when they have to in the female stage. We know this because you can take the flowers from the field when they start to open in the male stage, and then that pollen arrives when the flower was open in the female stage. Okay, so most of the pollen arrives to the flowers in the male stage, and that's normal because the bees go to the male flowers to collect pollen and they self-pollinate the male flowers. But that pollen is not useful because the stigma is no longer receptive. When you increase the number of beehives from 10 to 24, that's a lot of beehives in an avocado orchard, we get about 50% of the flowers with pollen. That's pretty good. But when you look at when those flowers get the pollen, you get pollen only in 12% of the flowers in the female stage. So even with this high amount of beehives, we have a pollination problem in avocado. And I think this is one of the main problems in avocado worldwide, that you don't get enough pollen to the flowers. The second question is, okay, you get pollen to the flowers, but is there a minimum number of pollen grains that you need to get fertilization? Because the result that I showed you today is that usually when you get pollen to the flowers, you get about 1 to 5 pollen grains, very few. So we did a similar experiment to the one I told you before about flower quality. So we applied pollen to the flowers, and the next day we collected the stigmas and we left the ovaries in the tree. So you know how many pollen grains were in the flower, and then you know what happened with that flower. Okay? So this is what we get. Of course, when you get, the colors are just flowers that dropped early, that they were kept for a few days, and then green, they reach fruit maturity, okay? Of course, when you have 0 pollen grains on the flower, there is no fruit set. But look at this, when you have 1 to 5 pollen grains, very few flowers produce fruits. Of course, when you have more than 40 pollen grains, you get fruits. But this situation of more than 40 pollen grains is not possible in nature. This is when we apply pollen by hand. Usually, in most cases, you get very few pollen grains. So, summarizing this, you get pollen to very few flowers, and the flowers that receive pollen get few pollen grains. So we have a pollination problem in avocado. And we got similar observation in commercial orchards. These are just different orchards in Spain with different situations. Some growers added beehives to the orchard. In some orchards, there were pollinizer trees. In others, there were not. In all cases, the results were very similar. In most of the flowers, there was no pollen grains. And when you get pollen grains, it's between 1 to 5 pollen grains per flower. Very few flowers got more than 6 pollen grains per stigma. And the same situation we observed in Peru in different orchards in the country. Usually, no pollen into the female stage in most of the flowers. This is in the north of the country, and this is in the south of the country. Of course, you increase, when you have more flowers with pollen, you have more yield. This is an example in Peru. So you have the orchard A and orchard B. This is in the male stage and female stage. You get more flowers with pollen in orchard A than orchard B in the female stage. And of course, production is higher in this orchard. So when you increase pollination success, you're going to increase yield. So we have to work on that. We have to work in trying to increase pollination success in avocado. So you need to put, of course, beehives because you have an effect increasing pollination and fruit set. But we are depending only so far in most countries on honeybee. There are other insects out there that can help us to pollinate avocado. In the case of Europe, we have more than 1,000 species of solitary bees that they are not used commercially in agriculture, and they are very interesting because they are able to carry pollen. They don't make beehives. This is an example of the kind of bee hotels that we make in Spain. So they carry pollen to feed the larvae that they are going to produce. And this is an example of one of these bee hotels with this activity of solitary bees just carrying pollen from the flowers to these hotels. And by the way, here, this, for example, is pollen that these bees carried, and we check with molecular markers, and some of this pollen is avocado pollen. So they are working also in the avocado flowers. But not only this kind of bees, there are other insects that can be also useful as pollinators for avocado. Of course, the honeybee, but also the bumblebee can be useful, at least in Israel. There are some reports that the bumblebee can be of interest for avocado pollination. Different species of wasps also. The flies are interesting. There are different kind of flies that can be useful for avocado pollination. Mainly these kind of flies, the syrphids, which are flies that resemble bees or wasps, but the eyes are eyes of flies. And these are very interesting for avocado pollination and also for other crops, not only avocado. And of course, you can see also butterflies and beetles in the avocado flowers, and some of them carry pollen on their bodies. This is an example of an experiment we did with flies, putting the flies inside this structure with the avocado trees inside. This is one of the flies. This is a commercial fly, which is sold in Spain for vegetable production, not for avocado, but the company is working with avocado to see if there's an effect. These are avocado pollen grains that we collected from the bodies of these flies. So they not only visit the flowers, but they are able to get pollen into their bodies. And this is the results of the study we made. This is fruit set. This is an enclosure with bumblebees. This is with these flies, and this is the control outside. So you can see that you get similar fruit set inside the cage and outside using this kind of flies. The trick here is how you keep the flies in your orchard, because with the bees it's very easy because the bees have to go back to the honey hive. But in the flies, well, we are trying to figure out how to attract the flies to the orchard, so you release the flies and they stay there. This is also the case in different countries. This is an example in Colombia, in which Melipona bees, these Native American bees, have been seen pollinating avocado trees in Colombia. Also flies, different species of this surface have been seen in avocado flowers in Colombia. The same results or similar results in Australia. In red is the pollen that arrives to the stigmas by honeybees, and in black with natural wild pollinators in Australia. So you see that when you increase the diversity of insects that are present in your avocado orchard, you can increase pollination, and then you can increase fruit set. So it's okay to rely on honeybees, but there is a world outside beyond the honeybees that can be useful for avocado pollination. So just to finish this topic, avocado production might be limited by pollinators deficit, and we need to evaluate this in the different avocado producing regions. And several insects, in addition to the honeybee, could be efficient in pollinating avocados. So when we go to the first question, what happened with all the flowers? Where have all the avocado flowers gone? Well, if we take into account environmental stress, temperature and humidity at flowering, flower quality, that most of the flowers have low quality. In some cases, you will need pollinizer trees for your avocado variety. And then when you have also a lack of pollinators, if you add all this together, then you probably can explain why we only get usually about 0.15% of avocado fruit set from all the flowers produced. And as I said, we need to perform these studies in the different avocado producing regions. And that's the end of my talk. Yes, I want to acknowledge my team there back in Spain and all of you for being here today.
Well, that was a great talk and a really great overview. I'm going to do the Zoom questions first so that we make sure we catch those before we do the in-person questions. So the first question is from Greg. If temperatures are rising and causing Hass to bloom earlier in March instead of April, wouldn't the temperature in March be higher now and near the same as April temperatures? So what's really the problem with the earlier?
The problem is that when we look at temperature increase, we see the average at the year average, and that's increasing. And usually what we are seeing, at least in Spain, is that we are getting higher night temperatures during the winter time. So that is causing the advancing in the flowering time, but still the temperatures at March are the normal temperatures at that month. So even if you have like an increase in the minimum temperatures in March, still the day temperatures are low at that time. So you have an advanced earlier blooming, but with normal temperatures at that time, so you have problems.
The second question was, has there been any multi-year supplemental pollination studies to augment what the insects do, not replace them? I can answer that. Mary Lou will be giving an update on her research on supplemental pollination. So hopefully you'll get some answers there. Okay, that's it for Zoom. We'll go there.
Yeah, about that question, just one thing that I want to mention is that I show here that you can apply pollen by hand. Commercially, that's not possible. I mean, by hand, because you can do it for research, but well, yeah, but that's for research, okay?
Okay, so you talked about the correlation between the flower nutritional health. Is there a correlation between, like, have you tested the pollen health? And if so, do you find that healthy flowers have healthier pollen as well?
We haven't checked that with the flowers, but we can see differences among varieties in pollen quality. So there are some pollinizers that the quality of the pollen is higher than others. But we haven't checked if there is a correlation between flower quality and pollen quality in the same flower.
I got a quick question. So when you're looking at augmenting the pollination or flower quality, what do you see differences between on and off years in terms of flower quality?
We did that study and we didn't see differences. The main differences were in the number of flowers produced, but the quality of the flowers was more or less the same. So you get less fruit in the off year because you get lower number of flowers.
Just kind of stepping back to the question on our climate change and pushing things earlier. We may be seeing higher minimum temperatures in March, April. California's minimum temperatures are rising faster than our maxes. So that's a good thing. But day length plays an extremely large part, I would think. We can't, it's shorter days in March than there are in April and May. Do you think that has an effect?
I don't think that's a problem in avocado. The origin of the avocado is in Central America. Days are more or less, they are not so different in length compared to California or to Spain. So I don't think that will be a big problem. For me, the main problem will be if you have very early blooming and you have low temperatures. Not only low temperatures, but also days like today, in which the bees are not going to be very happy working outside.
Exactly.
Just a quick question about fertilizing when the flowers are blooming. Seem I read somewhere that you don't want to fertilize because the bees aren't attracted to a flower that's been fertilized. Is there any truth to that?
I don't know about that. I cannot answer that. You have to be very, very careful though with fertilization. Also, when you apply, some people apply boron mainly in the flowering time. So because pollen grains, they need basically three things: sucrose, which is the carbohydrate that are present in the flowers, like the starch. They need boron, and they need calcium and magnesium for pollen germination and pollen tube growth. The tricky thing is that boron can be also toxic to the flowers and the plants in excess. So you can increase boron till a given value. If you go above that, then you're going to have problems. So you have to be very careful with that when you apply foliar or leaf fertilization at blooming time, okay? Depending on the results of your leaf analysis, then maybe you can do that, but very careful, especially with boron, which can be toxic to the flowers and the pollen in excess.
Inaki, has any study been done on the effect of girdling in the starch content of flowers?
No, I was discussing yesterday with Mary Lou. We were visiting an orchard and there was a heavy girdling done, and we decided that it would be nice to study what happens with those flowers, because you get earlier flowering, you get some effects on the leaves also that they are more yellow. So it would be nice to see what happens with the flower quality when you do girdling, but we haven't done anything like that.
How many consecutive days of good temperature do you need for fruit set to stick?
I don't know. Basically, the critical point is pollen germination and pollen tube growth, and that's a couple of days. And then you need that. For that, you need that between 15, 25 degrees Celsius. Once you get fertilization, you can have embryo abortion when temperatures are low, but much lower than that, like below 10 degrees or higher than 30 or 30 something Celsius. And then you can have embryo abortion. But the critical moment is when you have the pollen germination, pollen tube growth. The thing is that for each flower, that's going to last only a couple of days. But then you have the whole flowering season in avocado. In Spain, the flowering season lasts about 1 month. Here, I think is much longer. That's good for you, because in Spain, when you have 3 or 4 weeks of bad weather, then you can have big problems in fruit set. Here, because you have a longer flowering season, probably you can have different situations and better yield.
You mentioned that pollen is only viable for a few hours. So is applying pollen with drones and helicopter basically ineffective? The assumption being that the pollen is older than a few hours.
Yeah, we are studying that. My guess is that unless you do something to the pollen to increase viability, if you leave the pollen by itself, it's not going to be viable. But then maybe there are some experiments or some advances in maintaining the pollen for longer, okay? But at room temperature, the pollen in 1 day doesn't germinate anymore.
So what is, I mean, we're talking about trying to increase fruit set, but there's some optimal amount of fruit that the tree can carry load-wise before we start, and so maybe even though you can set some, it's aborting fruit because it can't carry that load. And so what is that? What is that upper limit? I mean, how much are we trying to chase in here that we can really effectively, the tree can effectively handle?
Okay, one thing is that, of course, the health status of the tree is going to determine how much fruit that tree can handle. Well, that's one thing. And then there were some studies, Marilu, maybe you can help me here. In South Africa, it was Wallstone that he predicted that the maximum 30 tons per hectare. That's the maximum you can get sustainably in avocado. Yeah, 30,000 pounds per acre. That's the maximum that you can sustain in avocado, for us. So that's of course there is a limit of how much fruit the avocado can handle, but I think usually we are much below that limit in most of the cases.
In some of your images, it looked like there were lots of pollen tubes. Does each pollen grain initiate its own pollen tube? And is there any interrelationship? I had heard from an earlier talk, I thought that they were working together to build one tube. So I'd love to understand that.
Yeah. Okay. In fact, it's a race. So there are pollen grains, not all, but many of them germinate, and they race, and only one is able to fertilize the ovule. Okay. When you have very few pollen, and most of the pollen tubes are going to stop doing this race. There's also an effect of when you have more pollen grains on the stigma, they also release calcium when they germinate, and that helps other pollen tubes to germinate and grow. So that's why when you have a very few pollen grains, usually maybe they germinate, but they're not able to produce very nice pollen tubes that reach the ovule. Okay, but it's a race. Only one is going to win and is going to fertilize the ovule. So the more pollen grains you have, the more likely that one will reach the ovule.
We talked a little bit, or you talked a little bit about the mineral elements, boron, calcium, magnesium, but you didn't really talk about the sugars or the sucrose or supplying of those carbohydrates during bloom. Are you doing any work or know of anything? Because there are a lot of new products that are claiming.
We're not doing any work ourselves, but I know there are some biostimulants and other products there that can help retain the fruits once you have fertilization. And that's okay. So there are some products out there, but keep in mind that for that, so for the flower to produce a fruit, you need fertilization first. So these products, what they do is they're going to be able to get better attachment of the flowers and fruitless to the tree, but you need pollination and fertilization before. They're not going to work if you don't have that. But there are some products that out there that are apparently they are increasing the fruit set once you have good pollination.
All right. Oh, I hate to cut off questions, but we're just like half an hour behind. So I think I will, but I know all the speakers are going to stay afterwards, so you can ask more questions.